Imagine this. A major bank in France has a vault designed to protect millions in cash, gold, and valuables. Security systems, heavy walls, thousands of safety deposit boxes. It should have been almost impossible to break into. But one man looked at the bank and noticed something the engineers had overlooked. Not a high-tech machine, not an army of criminals, just a weakness hidden beneath the city. Then, over weeks of preparation, a group found a way into the vault from below. And when the bank finally discovered what had happened, hundreds of boxes had been opened. Millions in valuables were gone. But here's the part that makes this story unbelievable. The man behind the plan wasn't a famous criminal mastermind. He was a photographer. And after the robbery, the story became even stranger, because the police eventually caught him, and he still managed to disappear. So how did a photographer find a weakness that an entire bank had missed? And how did one of the most audacious bank robberies in history actually happen? This is the story of the Nice bank heist.
Albert Spaggiari was not the kind of person you'd expect to lead one of France's most audacious bank robberies. He wasn't a famous gangster. He wasn't a military expert. And he wasn't known for walking around with a crew of criminals. He was a photographer, a man who appeared to live a relatively ordinary life in Nice, France. But behind that ordinary image was something much more interesting. Spaggiari understood something that many people overlook when they look at a security system. A system doesn't have to be completely broken to be defeated. Sometimes you only need to find the part nobody thought would matter. And in 1976, Spaggiari began looking at a bank in Nice from a very different perspective. The target was the Société Générale bank. Inside the bank was something that made it especially attractive to thieves. Hundreds of private safety deposit boxes. Boxes belonging to people who trusted the bank to protect their most valuable possessions. Cash, jewelry, gold, documents, personal valuables. And behind all of that was a heavily protected vault. From the outside, it looked like exactly the kind of place nobody could simply walk into. There were walls, locks, security procedures, and the confidence that comes with a building designed to keep people out. But Spaggiari wasn't planning to walk through the front door. He was looking somewhere else. Down, below the bank. Because underneath the streets of Nice was a network of sewers. And somewhere beneath that city was a possible path into the vault. The question was no longer, can we break into the bank? The real question was, can we reach the bank without entering it? And that single change in perspective would eventually turn an ordinary photographer into the central figure of one of France's most infamous heists.
The bank was built to keep thieves out, but Spaggiari wasn't interested in fighting the bank's security. He wanted to go around it. The problem was simple. Getting from the sewer system to the vault would require far more than just digging a hole. The tunnel had to be planned carefully. The direction had to be right. The distance had to be measured. And most importantly, the people involved had to stay completely silent. Because one mistake could expose everything. Spaggiari eventually brought together a group of men who were willing to take the enormous risk. Their plan was surprisingly simple in concept. They would enter through the city's sewer system, dig beneath the bank, and reach the vault from underneath. No dramatic attack on the entrance. No attempt to overpower guards. No need to smash through the bank's front doors. The bank's strongest security was designed to stop someone coming into the building. It wasn't designed around the idea that someone might come up from underneath it, and that was the weakness. But there was another problem. The tunnel couldn't simply be dug directly toward the vault. They needed to know exactly where they were going. A few meters in the wrong direction could turn the entire operation into a dead end. So the robbery became less like a traditional bank heist and more like an engineering project carried out in complete secrecy. Night after night, the group worked underground, quietly, patiently, slowly moving closer to their target. Every meter brought them closer to millions of dollars in valuables. But every meter also increased the chance that someone would notice what they were doing. And above them, the bank continued operating normally. Employees arrived for work. Customers entered the building. Money moved through the financial system. Nobody looking at the bank from the street would have had any idea that a tunnel was being constructed underneath it. That was the genius of the plan. The bank was watching its doors. The robbers were approaching from below. And if their calculations were correct, the next place they would see wouldn't be a sewer. It would be the floor of the bank's vault.
By this point, the plan had become much bigger than a simple robbery. The men had to create a passage beneath the city and reach the exact location of the bank's vault, and they couldn't afford to rush. Every movement had to be controlled. Every sound mattered. Every mistake could end the entire operation. Above them, the bank continued its normal routine. Below it, the group was slowly creating a completely different route into the building. Their advantage was that almost nobody was looking down. The bank had security systems designed around the obvious threats: doors, locks, access points. But the robbers weren't trying to defeat those systems. They were trying to make them irrelevant. Eventually, the tunnel reached the area beneath the vault. Now came the most dangerous part. They had to get through the floor. If they broke through too early, someone could hear them. If they broke through in the wrong place, the entire operation could fail. And if they were discovered underground, there would be nowhere to hide. So the group waited. They prepared. And eventually, they made their way into the vault area. Inside were hundreds of safety deposit boxes. Think about what that meant. They weren't looking for one specific package. They had access to hundreds of private boxes belonging to customers. And that meant the potential value inside was enormous. But there was another problem. Opening hundreds of boxes would take time, a lot of time. And every minute they spent inside increased the chance of discovery. Yet the group had already solved one of the biggest problems. They weren't fighting their way into the vault. They were already inside it. The walls that were supposed to protect the bank had become walls surrounding the robbers instead. And then they began opening the boxes, one after another. The scale of the operation was becoming clear. This wasn't a quick smash and grab. It was a carefully planned operation that had taken weeks of preparation and was now turning into one of the biggest bank robberies France had ever seen. Once they were inside the vault, the robbery entered its most dangerous stage, because getting into the vault was only half the problem. Now they had to get everything they wanted and get back out. Inside were hundreds of safety deposit boxes. The group began opening them one by one. Cash, jewelry, gold, diamonds, personal valuables. The exact contents of every box were different, but together they represented an enormous amount of wealth. And there was something unusual about the situation. The vault was normally a place where time worked in the bank's favor. The longer someone stayed inside, the greater the chance they would be discovered. But the robbers had planned around that. They had brought food and supplies with them. They weren't expecting to be inside for a few minutes. They had prepared for a much longer operation. That meant the vault itself became their temporary workspace. For hours, they continued opening boxes and sorting through what they found. And as the hours passed, the scale of the robbery became harder to comprehend. This wasn't someone stealing a few bags of cash. It was hundreds of private accounts being opened in a single operation. The group eventually reached hundreds of boxes, and the value of what they took would later be estimated at millions of dollars. But perhaps the strangest part was what they did next. Instead of simply destroying everything and disappearing, they left behind a message. A message that would make the robbery even more famous. The thieves had entered through the floor.
They had spent days underground. They had broken into hundreds of safety deposit boxes, and now they were preparing to leave. But the police didn't know where they were. The bank didn't know how they had entered, and the people outside had no idea that the vault had been occupied for days. The robbers had managed to turn one of the most secure places in the city into their own temporary headquarters. And then came the moment that could have ruined everything. They had to leave the same way they came in, through the tunnel. Because getting into the vault was impressive. Getting out without being caught was the real test.
After spending days inside the vault, the group finally prepared to leave. They had taken valuables from hundreds of safety deposit boxes, and now they had one final problem. How do you leave a bank that doesn't even know you've been inside? The answer was the same route they had used to enter: the tunnel. They moved their stolen valuables back through the underground passage and returned toward the sewer system. Then they disappeared into the city. For the bank, the discovery was almost unbelievable. There had been no dramatic explosion, no armed confrontation, no obvious attack on the building. Instead, employees arrived to discover something that looked almost impossible. The vault had been breached from underneath. The safety deposit boxes had been opened, and an enormous amount of property was missing. Investigators immediately began trying to understand how it had happened. How could a major bank with serious security measures have been entered without triggering the kind of response everyone expected? The answer was sitting beneath the building: a tunnel. And that tunnel completely changed the investigation. The robbery became one of the biggest stories in France. But the police now had another problem. They knew what had happened. They knew the approximate scale of the theft, but they still needed to find the people responsible. And eventually, investigators began connecting the operation to one name: Albert Spaggiari, a photographer. Someone who didn't fit the image of the criminal mastermind people expected. But the investigation continued, and eventually Spaggiari was arrested. But the investigation continued, and eventually Spaggiari was arrested. It looked like the story was over. The mastermind had been caught. The police had their suspect. The court would decide what happened next. But Spaggiari had one more surprise, because getting caught wasn't the end of his story. It was about to become the beginning of an even more unbelievable escape. But the arrest didn't end Albert Spaggiari's story. Now he had to face the consequences of the robbery. He was taken to court in Nice, France, where investigators and prosecutors were trying to establish exactly how he and his group had carried out such an extraordinary operation. The evidence against him was serious. The bank had been robbed. Hundreds of safety deposit boxes had been opened. And investigators believed Spaggiari had played a central role. But then something happened that turned the entire case into another unbelievable chapter. Spaggiari was brought to the courthouse. And instead of simply waiting for the legal process to finish, he started looking for a way out. The courthouse had windows, and outside those windows was the city. For most people inside the building, a window was just a window. For Spaggiari, it was an opportunity. He eventually managed to escape from the courthouse in an extraordinary way. And suddenly, the man who had already managed to get into one of France's most secure bank vaults was a fugitive again. The police launched a massive search, but Spaggiari had disappeared. This created a completely different problem for investigators. They could investigate the tunnel. They could investigate the stolen valuables. They could question suspects, but they couldn't put Spaggiari back in custody. He was gone.
and the story became even more famous because of the contrast. First, he had escaped the bank security by going underneath the building. Then, after being arrested, he found a way out of the courthouse. It was almost as if every security system placed in front of him became another puzzle to solve. But there was still one question hanging over the entire case. What happened to all the stolen money and valuables? And more importantly, where did Albert Spaggiari go? Because escaping from a courthouse is one thing. Staying hidden from the authorities for years is something completely different.